In this video, we'll begin with Chapter 7. So unfortunately, we don't have time to cover the entire chapter, so we will not be covering Chapter 7, Module 1, which is basically the neuromuscular junction. We'll start with Chapter 7, Module 2, which are brain mechanisms of movement. So in this video, we'll cover the primary motor cortex. So here's all the various areas involved in movement. And you'll see here, hopefully you remember this primary motor cortex from our previous chapter for anatomy, and it backs up right next to that primary somatosensory cortex. We also called the primary motor cortex the precentral gyrus, and the primary somatosensory cortex the postcentral gyrus. And there was that central sulcus that divides the two. So this is in the frontal lobe. And you notice we have a primary motor cortex, but we also have a premotor cortex. We have the red nucleus that we've talked about. We have the cerebellum that we will talk about, and the basal ganglia that we'll talk about. All right, so the primary motor cortex, shown here in red, as we saw in the previous slide, is also known as the precentral gyrus, and it's located in that frontal lobe. So here's that central sulcus, and that central sulcus divides the front half of the brain, or the frontal lobe, from the rest of the brain. And so this primary motor cortex is in that precentral gyrus, and axons from that precentral gyrus connect to neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. So these neurons in this primary motor cortex send projections down to the brainstem and the spinal cord that control fine motor movements. And it's going to generate the impulses that control the muscles. So for humans, our movements depend on both axons going to the motor neurons and the interneurons, where in other mammals, they may only go to the interneurons. And perhaps it's different to allow us to have more fine motor control and dexterity. So the primary motor cortex, we're going to talk about different types of movement and different types of movement control. And so what the primary motor cortex is really responsible is for issuing orders to the muscles that are important in complex actions, like walking, talking, writing. And the primary motor cortex issues orders controlling the opposite side of the body. So the primary motor cortex controls movement of specific areas on the opposite or contralateral side of the body. And we've had this term contralateral before, so hopefully it sounds familiar to you. So again, the idea is that our left motor cortex is going to send issues to the right side of the body and control movement on the right side of the body. Our right motor cortex is going to issue orders and send control movement on the left side of the body. So what this diagram is showing you here is just the specificity of the motor cortex. So we've talked about this before, this idea of somatotopy, the idea that, it takes a lot of muscles to move our lips and our mouth in the way that to produce words accurately, right? And so it takes up, our lips take up a big volume and our tongue take up a big volume of space in that motor cortex. Whereas in order to move, let's see if I can, I can't even find an area. The shoulder. The shoulder, even though it's much bigger than our face, doesn't take up as much of much motor skill space. But again, it's not necessarily one for one. A cell that controls movement in one finger may also control movement in another, but the idea is that there is this somatotopy with areas that require more fine motor control having more neurons dedicated to them in the motor cortex. So as we said, the primary motor cortex controls movements, but it doesn't plan them, okay? So there are other areas that are involved in planning. And so these are the other areas that your book talks about that are involved in planning and movement. And I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing the exact specifics of each of these. I just want you to be aware that the primary motor cortex issues the orders to the muscles, but it's a very complex process that's involved. We have this posterior parietal cortex here. And the posterior parietal cortex is going to keep track of the position of the body in relative to the world. It's important for planning and movement. It takes visual information, perhaps even auditory information, and synthesizes that to help with our motor commands. The supplementary motor cortex here is important when you have some sort of rapid sequence of events. The premotor cortex, we see it firing action potentials just before the primary motor cortex. It's also giving us information about the body's current position, our posture, and of course, that information is important on moving towards some sort of stimuli in the environment. And then we have the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex, it helps delay movements when necessary, looks for probable outcomes for different movements. It helps keep our movements organized. If you had damage to this area of the brain, it might be a little bit disorganized. Our movements might be disorganized. So again, just a little bit of information about some of the different areas. What I want you to know is that the primary motor cortex is issuing those orders to the muscles via the motor neurons and the interneurons in the brainstem and spinal cord, but it doesn't plan them. There's a lot of other areas that are involved in planning them, and these areas are all really firing action potentials before that primary motor cortex. So we have two main pathways from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord to control different types of movements. And these are called corticospinal tracts. So let's say that, corticospinal tracts. They're paths that go from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, and mostly from the motor cortex, but we'll see there's some other areas that contribute to one of these pathways. So one tract is the lateral corticospinal tract, and then we have the medial corticospinal tract. So if you remember, what that means is lateral is going to be kind of on the outside, and medial means towards the center. So the lateral corticospinal tract would send projections to the lateral parts of the body, and the medial corticospinal tract would send projections to the medial parts of the body. So here's a diagram from your book just showing you these two tracts. This is the lateral corticospinal tract, and this is the medial corticospinal tract. So if you notice, mainly projections from the primary motor cortex, but perhaps some other areas as well. They come down here, and then they're going to cross over at the pyramids of the medulla, traveling through the red nucleus that we discussed previously. And then you see they cross over here. So it's starting in, so this would be the left hemisphere, coming down and then crossing over to the right side of the spinal cord to control the right side of the body. Here we have projections, including the primary motor cortex, but other areas of the cortex as well. Those come down and they're going to transfer to both sides of the body. And it's going to be involved in bilateral movements like standing, bending, turning, and walking. So again, the lateral corticospinal tract, also called the pyramidal tract, because you saw that where those axons cross over is at the So the lateral corticospinal tract is also called the pyramidal tract because what we saw on the previous slide was that those axons cross over at the pyramids of the medulla, or the pyramidal tract. So it's going to control precise movement in those peripheral limbs, so out in our fingers, out in our toes. It also is controlling the opposite side, or the contralateral side of the body. So again, those neurons in the left motor cortex are going to cross over at the pyramids of the medulla and control movement in our right hand. So again, axons extend from one side of the brain to the opposite side of the spinal cord, crossing over the pyramids of the medulla. And that's what this is showing you here in more detail. So here we start at the motor cortex. The red projections going down. And then here at the medulla, we cross over, and it goes to the other side of the spinal cord. The medial corticospinal tract, on the other hand, is a set of axons from many parts of the cortex. Besides the motor cortex, the reticular formation, the midbrain, the tectum, the vestibular nucleus, and axons go to both sides of the spinal cord because what the medial corticospinal tract is important in controlling are movements that require coordination. So it's controlling what are called bilateral movements. So things like turning. So think about, so just as you're sitting there right now, turn your body. And you notice how in order to turn your body, if you're sitting down, just turn that trunk of your body, it requires both sides to move. Stand up and bend down. It requires both sides to complete that movement. Or you're sitting down, stand up. Again, those are bilateral movements. You need both sides to work together to complete that motion.